Hello and welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepoint@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. This week, we're looking at reports on the deadly conflict in Ukraine and how media have been targeting China. Are they giving you the whole picture or reshuffling the pieces to fit their narrative? Now, some media are suggesting that China is cheering Russia's military operations in Ukraine, rooting for violence. Others are just plain overlooking China's diplomatic efforts and relationship with Ukraine. In times like this, it can be hard to know what's real and what's not. But facts cannot be ignored, and here are some. The military conflict broke out on February the 24th at 4 in the morning and has been going on for almost 2 weeks. So far, Russia says it has taken control of several areas in Ukraine, including the key city of Kherson in the south. The capital, Kiev, however, hasn't been taken, but shelling have been reported nearby. Russia has also secured control over Europe's largest nuclear power plant. To the temporary relief of everyone, the International Atomic Energy Agency has not reported any leak of dangerous radiation. The United Nations on March the 8th said it had so far recorded 474 civilian deaths and 861 injuries as a result of the conflict. Over the 2 million refugees who have fled the conflict as the conflict began, the ICRC said this humanitarian situation has actually been unfolding in eastern Ukraine over the past 8 years, but now the situation has mounted over into a humanitarian disaster across the country. Let's take a look at this.
So we already had a significant team in Ukraine, 600 colleagues in different cities. But of course now, with the mounting humanitarian needs, we definitely need to beef up and scale up our presence, our logistical supplies in the country in order to match the humanitarian disaster.
Immediately, Russia's actions have sparked probably the harshest and most wide-ranging sanctions from the West. Meanwhile, the United Nations and other international organizations have been busy calling for calm. A resolution by the UN General Assembly was passed, sending a strong message to Russia, but opinions are mixed among members, and I'll expand on that a bit later. Russia has not bent under the pressure, announcing actually countermeasures, the latest being the listing of dozens of what it calls unfriendly countries and regions, including the United States, the entire EU, Japan, the ROK, and China's Taiwan. Negotiations, on the other hand, have taken place 3 times between Russian and Ukraine delegations. Although progress is slow and their positions far apart, the fact that they are sitting down is a good sign. And China's stance has been clear since the beginning. When State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba on the phone on March the 1st, he said China is deeply grieved to see the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and highly concerned about the damage done to civilians. China always advocated respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. China calls on Ukraine and Russia to find a solution through negotiations and supports all constructive international efforts that are conducive to a political settlement. He went on to stress that the security of one country should not be achieved at the expense of the security of other countries, a consistent position from China all along. On the UN General Assembly vote I mentioned, which deplores Russia's actions in Ukraine in the strongest terms, China abstained on the grounds that it projects a Cold War mentality based on bloc confrontation. Listen to this.
遗憾的是， Regrettably, the draft resolution submitted to this emergency special session for vote has not undergone full consultations within the whole membership, nor does it take full consideration the history and complexity of the current crisis. It does not highlight the importance of the principle of indivisible security or the urgency of promoting political settlement and stepping up diplomatic efforts.
34 other members, including India, Pakistan, Cuba, Iran, Iraq, South Africa, Mozambique, and Algeria, and others, also abstained. Together with the 5 countries which voted against, they account for more than half of the world's population. But what has the media been saying about it all, especially China's role? When you read the headlines out there, things get a little muddled. In a US TV channel's headline on the UN resolution, they said that the UN voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you read the final text, it actually reads, the UN deplores, in the strongest terms, the aggressions by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. There is a distinction in meaning. Condemn means to declare something to be reprehensible, wrong, even evil, while to deplore means to express grief for or regret strongly, a less severe term. It may sound like I'm splitting hairs here, but it does matter. Had the resolution called to condemn Russia's action, I believe the number of yes votes would have been much less. Words matter, so does accuracy. Had the news outlet mixed these words knowingly, it would have been a prime example of playing with words. To put the record straight, the majority of UN members did not vote to condemn Russia's invasion. Another spectacle is the different treatment of China and India on the exact same issue. Both abstained from the UN vote, and in both countries, their voices, they both support and oppose the war like everywhere else, really. However, the media have taken a starkly different tone for the 2 countries. Both close partners to Russia, China is suggested, even suspected of being an accomplice, and Chinese citizens accused of cheering for invasion. India, on the other hand, is only trying to stay above the fray. The vocal support expressed by many Indian netizens were only part of the pro-Putin voices online. Compare the headlines from this same US newspaper. For India, world rebukes Russia, India tries to stay above the fray. For China, why the Chinese internet is cheering Russia's invasion. China is apparently getting the more favored nation treatment by the same newspaper. I thought US media is unbiased and independent. Maybe the journalists here got so exhausted picking through billions of comments on Chinese social media that they decided to take a break. As a matter of fact, there's been a fierce debate among Chinese about the war, and there are crazy comments on Chinese social media, just like everywhere else, really. But does that justify publishing a headline that singles out the Chinese as cold-blooded warmongers? The same article about China does acknowledge, while not condemning Russia's action, the Chinese government has not endorsed it either. But that's 5 minutes too late in shaping the reader's impressions. Some may say there are also some pro-Russia or pro-Putin comments in the US, and the media have not shied away from reporting on those. Well, these comments were from the political opponent of the Biden administration, the Republican Party, namely led by Donald Trump. It's a different ball game here. Basically, whatever one opposes, the other supports, and vice versa. Merit of the subject itself? Sorry, what was the subject? There's another important point missing from many news articles. With all the talk about China and Russia's limitless friendship, people tend to forget that China and Ukraine are friendly too. What did the Ukrainian side think of China's stance? If you rely on the Western news outlets or agencies, you won't get the easy answer. Here's why. This news agency article points out that there is a good relationship between the two sides. That's true. The headline goes, Ukraine asks China to make Russia stop war, says Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. In January, the article goes, Chinese President Xi Jinping marked 30 years of ties with Ukraine, hailing the deepening political mutual trust between them. Ukraine is a hub in the Belt and Road Initiative, a sprawling infrastructure and diplomatic undertaking that bounds China closer with Europe. Also true. The article goes on to report the latest phone conversation between the country's top two top diplomats by quoting from the Ukrainian side only. Ukraine's foreign minister asked his Chinese counterpart to use Beijing's ties with Moscow to stop Russia's military invasion of its neighbor. Nothing wrong with that, but what do the Chinese say about the call? According to an English language statement by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ukrainian foreign minister called China's role constructive. Well, some may question whether the Chinese statement is accurate. Then they should also question whether the Ukrainian version is accurate. Had the Chinese statement been inaccurate, the Ukrainian side would have raised the issue, right? This news agency piece only channels from one side and missed an important piece of information from the other side. Was it laziness or was it a matter of different taste? I don't know. Clearly, the Ukrainian appreciation of China's constructive role in the issue does not sound so politically correct in the West at the moment. Finally, I want to bring up the silencing of certain voices from one side of the conflict. After the war erupted, the EU banned Russian news outlets, some Russian news outlets, accusing them of spreading lies to justify Putin's war and to sow division in Europe. When there are clearly different sides to the story, does it really serve the interest of Europeans to prevent them from hearing voices from the other side? If the West has been advocating freedom of expression and safeguarding the other's rights to disagree, how do you draw the line and where? Who should decide? And, by the way, let's not forget, these media organizations, these institutions have claimed that they are the textbook example of professional journalism. Anyway, there are efforts to temper with information that certain media do not like to see or do not want to be seen. It's a bit like playing the game of Tetris, where players fill empty spaces by moving differently shaped pieces around. But to manipulate the pieces to reach that goal is a step too far. I hope the game of Tetris won't be sanctioned anytime soon. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after that with our guests' contributions and discussions. Stay with us. Welcome back to Headline Buster. I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Jiang Wenran, advisor to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, joining us from Edmonton, Canada. Mr. Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategy, joining us from Philadelphia, the United States. That's a consulting company. And Mark Sleboda, a Russian international relations analyst, joining us from Moscow, Russia. Gentlemen, welcome to Headline Buster on this very dividing and emotionally charged issue here. First of all, I want to go to Professor Jiang Wenran here. First of all, how do you look at China's position as demonstrated by its abstention, for instance, at the UN General Assembly vote and expressed by various levels of Chinese officials and leaders so far?
Well, officially speaking, China is actually has been in a very delicate position. We know that China has for decades abided with the UN Basic Charter of non-interference into other countries' affairs, sovereign principles, and that's China for its own 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And yet, only recently, President Xi and President Putin declared also that the 2 countries are strategic partners with no upper limits. So China is kind of trying to tell the world that it does not openly endorse what a Russian is doing, and yet at the same time is not openly condemning it, rather calling for peaceful resolution. I think the latest conversations between Minister Wang Yi with the multiple international counterparts, as well as President Xi Jinping, signaled a slightly shift towards emphasizing more about getting the things maybe resolved peacefully, and express stronger terms in caring about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, because China proposed 6 points at UN about the humanitarian crisis and how to manage it. So I think China now is probably moving from being a little bit ambiguous in the beginning, the first week or so, into the second week, now probably moving towards potentially coming out as the major power to mediate a ceasefire of some kind.
As we can see, the situation has also been escalating and the humanitarian situation has also been deteriorating. So I think China's apparent shift of position or growing concern for the humanitarian crisis is also a response to the situation. But China clearly hasn't endorsed this war and is not endorsing the use of violence in resolving international issues. And I think that position really has to be very clear. I think China is more focused on how to resolve the issue going onward. I want to go to our guest in Russia, Mark. How do you look at the kind of divisions in the United Nations among UN members, and how do you look at China's position so far?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at the map of countries that have actually implemented sanctions against Russia and those that have not, you see a very clear bipolar divide to the world that is merging, pushed for decades now by the United States and its pursuit of global hegemony. And it's, the West versus the rest in a lot of regards. China's position, while ostensibly trying to maintain this diplomatic veneer, at the same time, they have clearly laid out what they regard as the root causes of the conflict. And that is the meddling that the U.S. has done in Ukraine to help bring to power an anti-Russian government in 2014 with the overthrow of the government, and the expansion of NATO eastwards continually for the last couple of decades, now trying to bring major countries like Ukraine right on Russia's border into the ostensibly defensive, but in reality aggressive and offensive military alliance.
Let's go to our guest in the United States, Brendan. What role is the United States trying to play here, and do they have that kind of moral leadership, moral qualification to make these kind of calls at this moment?
I think anybody can look at the situation in Ukraine and say, 3 weeks ago, Ukraine was a functioning country where people had water and electricity, and today they don't. They are dealing with bombs and guns and death and people dying in apocalyptic situations and cities under siege. What's different? Russian troops crossed the border, initially to declare independence for separatists that they have armed for years, as my colleague has apparently accused the United States of doing, but Russia openly armed these people, and they're now in Ukraine killing people for really indefinable goals about, oh my goodness, my neighbor has politics I don't love. Okay, well, that's what we have when we have plurality in the world, differences of opinion. We don't just run across the border and go, no, 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 I really don't like what you're doing. Russia is doing that, and they're killing thousands of people in the process. So whether it's about history,
the UN says 400 something people have been killed. Okay, they haven't killed thousands of civilians. Let's get that straight.
I said people, not just civilians, but people. Soldiers are people. When people
okay,
die,
make that distinction. Yes.
But people, soldiers are people. People die, And so whether we could talk about history or whose soapbox is bigger, or whose moral history is cleanest over the last 1,000 years or not, today with one voice, I think a lot of people can get together and say, hey, this was really awful. Whether a UN body or a global governance can use the words condemn, deplore, or whatever other sort of semantic choosing of global democracy and global debate and diplomacy, I think we can pretty much clearly say this was an act of aggression by one country against another sovereign country. I think what it's saying is when troops cross a border into another sovereign country, that's a problem. That's a fair and clear determination of a national border that no one is arguing that Ukraine, except for Russian leadership, that Ukraine is a sovereign independent country, that's a problem.
Iraq.
All right. Okay. Is that Mark?
Yes.
Want to react here? Okay. Go ahead.
I think one of the problems in the American political pundit sphere is the 15-second memory that they have. Of course, they can't remember the U.S. bombings, invasions, military occupations of Serbia, Iraq, the 20-year bloody military occupation of Afghanistan, the complete destruction of Libya, the ongoing U.S. military occupation of Syria, the U.S. 20-year bombing campaign of Somalia, and the U.S. military support for the Saudi genocide in Yemen.
Mark, I'm also going to put this question to you because it is a tough question. Does one have the right to correct a wrong with another wrong? Because that's what people are saying about this action. Look, you have a long list of all the atrocities the United States has committed over the years and continues to do that. But does that give other countries the right to commit similar things in order to say, okay, you have been doing that, why don't I have the right? Does that logic hold water?
Yeah, full disclosure. My wife is Crimean, and my in-laws live in Simferopol, and we have family all across East Ukraine, in Donbass, Kharkov, and Odessa. So I'm a little close to the ground, and that certainly gives me a very strong personal stake in what is going on and has been going on in Ukraine for the last 8 years. But it also gives me a perspective of the people of East Ukraine who have been politically repressed for the last 8 years since the overthrow of the government in 2014, and whose voices are completely left out of the Western mainstream media narrative because their existence is inconvenient for US geopolitical goals. And the regime that seized power in Kiev in 2014 with US support and arming has been waging a brutal military campaign in East Ukraine for the last 8 years. Some 15,000 people have been killed. And this is in an attempt to extend their seizure of power in Kiev to the rest of the country.
Mark, I also have to emphasize here, let's quote the correct numbers that are cited by the United Nations here. At this moment, I cannot independently verify those numbers, so you have to be confident in what you're saying in quoting these numbers. I hope you are.
Yes, I am.
Okay, readers should check, yes.
Yes. Readers are free to do so, and I will post in the comments myself the links to those numbers.
Okay.
And after 8 long years of failed diplomatic efforts, the US-backed Kiev regime's refusal to implement the Minsk Accords, which have supposedly been agreed upon by everyone to bring a political reconciliation between the US-backed regime in Kiev and the people of East Ukraine from the events of 2014. It has been solidified in a UN Security Council resolution as international law, but was left on the floor, leaving Russia after 8 long, bloody years of civil conflict in Ukraine to finally feel, with the ongoing NATOization of Ukraine on the ground, the building of military bases, there's some 10,000 NATO trainers and advisors in the country and flooding the country with arms. They finally felt that there really was no diplomatic option left over to, help protect the lives of the people
All right.
of East.
Brendan, you wanted to say something. I give you the chance. Then I have to go to Professor Jiang, who has been standing by very graciously.
Wenran is great, and I do apologize, Wenran. I'll keep it quick. That recount of history is bizarre. It also redistricts the entire geography of the country, including justifying the location of Russian troops in areas that are nowhere near the areas of conflict over the last 8 years, including the capital that is in the heart of the country. Both sides are playing games in Ukraine. Ukraine has, like any of the post-Soviet republics, struggled since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but it was still an independent country. I lived in Ukraine around the turn of the century. Ukraine is a country that has divisions, but the idea about whether we were ever heading towards continued lasting peace or not, we'll never know. Why? Because Russia started arming separatists. People started playing on both sides with the domestic politics of the country. And at the end of the day, Russia wasn't going to let a peaceful neighbor join a political alliance it doesn't like. That's the pure and simple end of the story. That was going to always be how this ended, according to Russia.
So it's a matter of
lost the Soviet Union, they want it back.
Let's get some social media comments and let's try to react to those. So let's take a look at them. Jeffrey Rudolph, Ukraine is microcosm of today's geopolitical, and the devil is in the details. From Lupita Hoda, Ukraine has been misled into war. The West isn't wanting end of war, but they keep arming Ukrainians, so the war continues. Professor Jiang, first.
It will be an ideal situation if we live in a moral world, if we live in a just world or a legal world. But unfortunately, as an international relations scholar, I can tell you we don't live in such a world. You can say the law of jungle is humanly constructed, it may be, but that has been the case. Ukraine today clearly in the war because Russia does not want it to be a part of NATO. Just like back 60 years ago in 1962, Cuba was not allowed to deploy the missiles from the Soviet Union. For that, the Americans, for its own security, would like to go to war, even nuclear war. So I'm telling our viewers that in the current world, smaller countries, in order to survive, they have to balance between bigger powers, and the bigger powers play the role of might is right. And therefore, that has always been the case throughout world history. We would like to change that, but that's the situation. So therefore, the best solution for Ukraine's people's sake is better to search for a way to end this war as soon as possible.
Okay.
Let's not make this into some kind of 1980s Afghanistan in order to achieve somebody else's goal to defeat Russia. Let's end the war. Maybe that's a better approach.
Okay, thank you so much. We have to leave it there. I want to end with this message. The world is very much interconnected, maybe more interconnected than we believe, and now we're finding out. Many thanks to all of our viewers for having followed us and for having shared with us your insights. That's it for this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. Thank you very much for joining us, and as always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. You've got the point.